There are 8 billion people on this planet. You are going to see this reading if you are destined for a beautiful, blessed marriage very, very soon. Before we even get deeper into this reading, there is something about this first card that I want you to notice, because the Ten of Pentacles isn't really about a temporary connection. Symbolically, this card speaks about the kind of relationship that becomes part of your life story, family, stability, belonging, a future that feels established rather than uncertain. And that's interesting for this topic because the message isn't simply about finding someone. It's about finding someone who may completely change your idea of what your future was supposed to look like. You may have a very specific picture in your mind of the person you would end up with. Maybe you imagine a certain personality, a certain appearance, a certain lifestyle. Maybe you've always been attracted to a particular type of person. And somewhere along the way, you've quietly convinced yourself that's the kind of person I'll probably marry. But this card immediately makes me question that assumption, because the Ten of Pentacles asks us to look beyond chemistry, beyond excitement, beyond the person who gives you butterflies 5 minutes after meeting them. It asks something much deeper. Who actually fits into the life you're trying to build? And that distinction is going to matter enormously throughout this reading, because your unexpected person may not be the person who immediately checks every box you've created in your head. They may not even be someone you would have chosen based purely on first impressions. In fact, you might initially look at this person and think, there's no way, and yet, there is something about the way this connection develops that slowly changes your perspective. The Ten of Pentacles represents something becoming real through consistency, someone showing up, someone becoming familiar, someone becoming dependable, someone whose presence gradually starts feeling less like excitement and more like home. And I think that's the first clue. The person you never expected may not enter your life with some dramatic announcement that says, I'm your future spouse. It may happen much more quietly. You notice how they treat you. You notice how comfortable you are around them. You notice that conversations feel easier than expected. And then one day, you realize something has changed. You're no longer asking yourself whether they're your type. You're asking yourself, why does being with this person feel so natural? And that's where this reading begins. Because the biggest surprise may not be who this person is. It may be how completely your definition of love changes once you meet them. And I think that's exactly where the next card becomes so interesting. Because the Tower is not a card that quietly agrees with the picture you already have in your mind. It shakes it. It challenges it. It almost feels like something comes in and says, no, you're looking at this completely differently than you should be. And that is very significant when we're talking about someone you never expected to marry, because the person coming through here may not fit neatly into the version of love that you've already created for yourself. They may actually disrupt it. Maybe this person doesn't look like the people you've dated before. Maybe they don't have the personality you normally go for. Maybe, initially, there isn't that immediate feeling of, oh my gosh, this is exactly my type. And that's what makes this so interesting. Because I feel like some of you have been conditioned to recognize attraction in a very specific way. You know that feeling, the intensity, the butterflies, the uncertainty, the wondering whether someone likes you, the constant thinking about them. And sometimes we mistake that intensity for compatibility. But the Tower comes in and completely challenges that. Because what if the person you're actually meant to build something real with doesn't create chaos inside of you? What if they create clarity? What if instead of wondering where you stand with them, you actually know? Instead of constantly questioning their intentions, they show you. Instead of making you chase their attention, they give it naturally. And maybe at first that feels strange to you because you're used to something else. You're used to having to figure people out. And this person may be surprisingly easy to understand. That's where I feel this unexpected element becomes really important. Because you may initially put this person into a category in your mind. We're just friends. Or they're not really someone I would date. Or even, that's not the kind of person I usually fall for. And then something happens. Something shifts. And suddenly, the way you've been seeing them doesn't quite make sense anymore. You start noticing little things. The way they listen. The way they remember something you said weeks ago. The way they make you feel comfortable without trying too hard. And you start thinking, wait, why am I noticing them now? And I don't think that's a small detail. Because the Tower suggests that before this person can become part of the future you're building, something about your old idea of love has to come down. Something you thought you wanted. something you thought you needed, something you thought was your type. And that's where this gets even more interesting, because there may be a very specific reason you were never supposed to recognize this person immediately. And I think the Six of Cups gives us a really interesting clue about that. Because this card has such a strong connection to familiarity, to memories, to someone or something that already feels strangely comfortable to you. And when I put that next to the Tower, I don't immediately feel like this is necessarily someone who comes completely out of nowhere. For some of you, this could actually be someone you've already crossed paths with, someone you've known before, someone you've spoken to, someone you've spent time around, and maybe you never looked at them in that way. That's the part that really stands out to me, because you may have already decided what this person means in your life. Maybe they're a friend, maybe they're someone from your past, maybe they're connected to your family, your work, your social circle, or even just a familiar part of your everyday life. And because they're familiar, you don't necessarily question it. You don't sit there thinking, could I marry this person? You just think, that's them, and that's it. But the Six of Cups makes me wonder if something about that perception eventually changes. Because sometimes the person we overlook isn't overlooked because there's nothing there. They're overlooked because we've become too familiar with them to imagine anything different. And that's a very different thing. You may have spent so much time seeing this person in one particular role that you never stopped to consider what could exist beyond that role. And then something changes. Maybe you have a conversation that you weren't expecting. Maybe you see them in a completely different environment. Maybe they open up to you about something personal. Maybe you notice the way they care for other people. Maybe you realize how safe you actually feel around them. And suddenly you're seeing the same person, but you're not seeing them the same way. And I think that's the psychological shift here. It's not necessarily that this person suddenly becomes someone completely different. You begin seeing what was already there, and that's why this connection could feel so unexpected, because your mind may have already placed them somewhere. You've already labeled them. You've already decided what kind of relationship is possible, but your feelings don't always follow the labels you've created. And maybe this person isn't the most exciting person you've ever met. Maybe they're not the person who immediately walks into a room and takes your breath away. Maybe they're quieter, more grounded, more familiar. Maybe they're actually the person who makes you feel like you can finally put your guard down, and that's when the attraction begins to feel different. Less like a rush. More like recognition, less like chasing, more like understanding. And I think there is something this person does, something very simple but very meaningful, that eventually makes you realize, nobody I've been attracted to before ever made me feel this way. And where this card adds something we haven't really talked about yet. Because the solar eclipse makes me think about what you don't see at first. Something can be right in front of you and still remain hidden. And that feels very connected to this person, because the quality that makes this relationship different may not be something that impresses you immediately. It may be something you only recognize after you've actually experienced it. This person may have a way of being there without making a big performance out of it. They don't necessarily need to announce that they care. They show you, maybe you have a difficult day, and instead of giving you 100 opinions, they simply stay. Maybe you pull away because you're overwhelmed, and instead of taking it personally, they give you space while still making sure you know they're there. Maybe you mentioned something once, something small, something you didn't even think they remembered. And weeks later, they bring it up. And you realize they were actually listening. That's different. Because there are people who know how to make you feel wanted for a moment. And then there are people who make you feel considered. And I think this person may fall into that second category. They may notice things about you that other people overlook. The little changes in your mood. The things you don't say. The moments when you're pretending you're fine. And they may not always know exactly what to say. But somehow, they know when to stay close. And that could be one of the reasons this connection initially confuses you, because you're expecting chemistry to feel like fireworks. But with this person, it may feel like relief. You may actually wonder why you're so comfortable around them, why you don't feel like you have to perform, why you can sit in silence without feeling awkward, why you can talk about something vulnerable without immediately regretting it afterward. And that's when something begins to shift inside you. Because you start realizing that maybe attraction isn't always about someone making your heart race. Maybe sometimes it's about someone making your nervous system finally calm down. And I think that could be a very important realization for you, especially if you've experienced connections where you were constantly questioning everything. where you wondered what someone meant, where you waited for a message, where you tried to understand whether their feelings were real. This person may not make you do that. And strangely enough, that might be what makes you notice them, because there may come a particular moment when you are going through something difficult and this person responds in a way you never expected. And after that moment, you may never look at them quite the same way again. Because sometimes you don't realize how much someone means to you until something interrupts the normal pattern between you. Not necessarily something dramatic. It could be distance, a change in routine, a period where you don't see each other as often. Maybe life simply gets busy, and suddenly you notice their absence. And that's when things can become very revealing, because when someone is always there, it's easy to take that presence for granted. You don't question it. You don't analyze it. You just assume they'll be there tomorrow. But when that familiar presence becomes quieter, you start noticing what it was actually giving you. You might find yourself wanting to tell them something. Something small happens during your day, and your first thought is to tell them. And then you stop, because they're not there. And you realize, why did I want to tell them that? That's the kind of moment I'm talking about. It's not necessarily some huge confession. It's something much more subtle. You begin to notice that this person has quietly become part of your emotional world. Maybe you start missing their conversations, their humor, the way they make you feel understood without having to explain everything. And then perhaps you see them again, and something feels different. Not because they changed, but because you did. You look at them a little longer. You listen a little differently. You become more aware of the way they speak to you, the way they look at you, the way they naturally move closer when you're talking. And suddenly that question comes back. Have I been looking at this person completely differently than I should have? And I think this is where the lunar eclipse gives us an important psychological clue. Sometimes something has to become less visible before we understand its importance. You don't always recognize what has been holding a place in your life until you imagine that place without it. And maybe that's what happens here. You begin imagining your life without this person, and you don't like the picture. Not because you were consciously planning a future with them, but because somewhere along the way, their presence became meaningful. And that realization can be surprisingly emotional, because now you're no longer thinking about whether they're your type. You're wondering whether you've been overlooking something that was right in front of you all along. And that's a very different question. But there is still one thing we haven't answered, because realizing that you are beginning to see them differently is only half of this story. The real question is, have they been seeing you differently too? And I think the Seven of Wands gives us a very interesting answer to that question, because this card makes me think about effort. Not chasing, not proving yourself, but choosing to protect something once you realize it actually matters to you. And that may be important here, because if this person is beginning to see you differently, they may not suddenly come out and say everything. They may show it through what they do. For some of you, it could be very subtle. They start making more time for you. They check in when they know you've had a difficult day. They remember something you mentioned weeks ago and bring it up again. Maybe they start asking questions they didn't used to ask. Not because they're being nosy, but because they genuinely want to understand you. And you may notice that their attention feels different, more intentional, more consistent. Almost like they're slowly making a place for you in their life without making some huge announcement about it. And that's where I think the Seven of Wands becomes interesting psychologically. Because there is a sense here of someone realizing, I don't want to lose this. Maybe neither of you expected to feel that way. Maybe they originally placed you in the same category you placed them in. Friend, acquaintance, someone familiar, someone they simply enjoyed having around. And then something changed for them too. Maybe they noticed your absence. Maybe they realized they were looking forward to seeing you. Maybe they caught themselves thinking about something you said long after the conversation ended. And suddenly, you're not just familiar anymore. You're important. And that realization can make someone behave differently. They may become more protective of the connection. They may be more careful with their words. They may start opening up about things they normally keep private. And for some of you, this could be the first real sign that the feelings aren't completely one-sided. Because when someone begins allowing you into the parts of themselves that they usually protect, that's meaningful. Especially if they're normally private. Especially if they're not the kind of person who opens up easily. And maybe you notice something else. They don't disappear when things become inconvenient. They don't only show up when everything is fun. They stay. When you're stressed, when you're busy, when you're not at your best, when life isn't particularly romantic, they still find a way to be present. And that may be the moment when something clicks for you. You realize this isn't simply attraction anymore. This person is becoming part of the way you experience your everyday life. And perhaps the strangest part is that they may be realizing the exact same thing about you. Neither of you planned for this. Neither of you necessarily saw it coming. But now there's something here that both of you seem unwilling to casually walk away from. And that brings us to the bigger question. Can this unexpected connection actually become something stable enough to build a life around? And the Five of Swords brings up something we really need to talk about here. Because if we're asking whether this person could actually become someone you build a life with, we have to look beyond how good the connection feels. We have to look at how the two of you handle real life. The disagreements, the stressful weeks, the moments when one of you doesn't understand the other, because a relationship can feel exciting when everything is going well. But compatibility becomes much clearer when something doesn't go according to plan. And this is where the Five of Swords feels important psychologically. It makes me think about the difference between being right and actually protecting the relationship. You may have experienced people before who turned every disagreement into a competition. Someone had to win. Someone had to prove their point. Someone had to have the last word. And maybe you became used to that. Maybe part of you even started believing that strong chemistry had to come with strong emotional reactions. But this person may approach conflict differently. They may actually want to understand what happened. They may be willing to say, okay, I didn't see it that way. Tell me what you meant. That's a very different kind of connection because you're not constantly defending yourself. You're not afraid that one difficult conversation is going to destroy everything. And that's where we come back to that Ten of Pentacles. Because building a life with someone isn't just about loving each other on the good days. It's about knowing that when life becomes complicated, you're still on the same side. Maybe you make plans together and something changes at the last minute. Maybe you're dealing with family responsibilities. Maybe one of you has a difficult month financially or emotionally. Maybe you're trying to figure out where you actually want to live, what kind of home you want, what your future should look like. And instead of one person carrying everything, you figure it out together. That matters. Because the person you once thought was not your type may actually be giving you something your old type never could. Not just attraction, partnership. You can still be yourself around them. You don't have to shrink. You don't have to constantly impress them. You don't have to wonder whether you're asking for too much simply because you want consistency. And maybe that's the strange realization. The qualities you once overlooked may become the qualities you value most. Their patience, their honesty, their willingness to communicate, their ability to stay grounded when things get difficult, their respect for your individuality. And slowly, the question changes again. You're no longer asking, is this exciting enough? You're asking, could I actually build a peaceful life with this person? And the answer may begin to feel much clearer. But there is something about the Five of Swords that tells me this story isn't completely simple yet. Because even when two people have the potential to fit beautifully together, there can still be one unexpected obstacle standing between them and the future they could create. The Three of Swords brings us directly into that uncomfortable part of the story. Because sometimes the obstacle isn't another person. It isn't distance. It isn't even timing. Sometimes it's what you've already been through. And that may be especially important here because this connection is asking you to recognize love in a way that feels different from what you're used to. Maybe you've been hurt before. Maybe you've learned to be careful. Maybe you've gotten very good at recognizing red flags, protecting your peace, and keeping your expectations low. And honestly, that's understandable. But sometimes protection can become so familiar that we don't notice when we're protecting ourselves from something good too. And this person may arrive at exactly the wrong time for the version of you that has already decided what love is supposed to look like. You may think they're too calm, too predictable, too different from the people you've been attracted to before, or maybe you simply aren't looking for anything serious when this connection starts becoming important. And that's where the contradiction comes in, because everything about this person may make sense, and yet part of you may still hesitate. You may question it, you may look for the problem, you may wonder why it doesn't feel more complicated. And I think that's one of the things the Three of Swords can symbolize psychologically. The heart doesn't only remember love, it remembers disappointment. So even when something healthy appears, the old experiences can still influence the way you interpret it. Maybe they take longer to open up, and you assume they're not interested. Maybe you become distant because you're afraid of becoming attached. Maybe they sense that hesitation and step back too. And suddenly, two people who actually care about each other are both waiting for the other person to make the first move. That's where things can become complicated. Not because the connection isn't meaningful, but because neither person wants to be the one who gets hurt. And for some of you, there may also be a practical complication, different schedules, different responsibilities, a past relationship that still needs emotional closure, or simply a point in life where neither of you expected to meet someone who could change your plans. And that's why this person may feel so unexpected. They don't arrive according to the plan you've created. They challenge it. They make you ask whether the future you imagined was actually the future you wanted, or just the future you became comfortable expecting. And eventually, something has to give, because you can't keep pretending you don't care when your actions are saying otherwise. And they can't keep pretending either. So this obstacle may actually become the moment that forces both of you to become honest about what you really want from each other. And that's where the Four of Cups becomes really important, because this card makes me think about something very simple. Sometimes what we're looking for is right in front of us, but it doesn't look the way we expected it to look. And that may be exactly what happens here. You may have spent a long time imagining the kind of person you would eventually choose. The personality, the chemistry, the lifestyle, the feeling. Maybe you thought love would feel obvious from the beginning, but with this person, it may become obvious slowly. And that's different, because now you're not choosing someone because they fit an image. You're choosing someone because of the way your life feels when they're actually in it. You start noticing the little things, how easy it is to make plans together, how you can disagree without feeling like the relationship is in danger, how you can have a completely ordinary Tuesday together and still feel content. And maybe that's when something inside you finally settles. You realize, I don't need this relationship to constantly prove itself to me. It just works. And I think that's a much bigger realization than it sounds, because there may have been a time when you confused uncertainty with excitement, when waiting for someone's attention felt like chemistry, when wondering where you stood felt like passion, when someone being difficult to understand made you more interested in understanding them. But this person may teach you something completely different. Love can be peaceful and still be deeply meaningful. You can be attracted to someone without constantly feeling anxious about them. You can want someone without feeling like you have to chase them. You can imagine a future with someone without losing yourself inside that future. And slowly, the idea of building a life together stops feeling like some huge decision. It starts showing up in ordinary conversations. Where would we live? What kind of home would we want? How would we handle this? What would our weekends look like? Who would we spend the holidays with? And maybe one day you hear yourself talking about the future and you realize you're naturally using the word we. That's the shift. Not fantasy, not a perfect picture, just two people gradually making room for each other. And maybe you meet the people who matter to them. Maybe they meet yours. Maybe you see how they treat your family. Maybe they see how you handle theirs. And somewhere in all of those ordinary moments, the person you once thought was completely wrong for you starts feeling strangely right. The person you never expected becomes the person you can actually imagine beside you. And that's when the idea of commitment stops feeling surprising. It starts feeling natural. But there's still one final piece here. Because if this person was never your expected type, never part of the original plan, and yet somehow became the person who fits your life so well, there has to be a reason you were never supposed to see them coming in the first place. The Nine of Cups brings us back to the heart of everything we've been talking about, because this card makes me think about what actually makes you feel fulfilled. Not what looks good from the outside, not what you thought you were supposed to want, but what genuinely makes your life feel better when you're living it. And maybe that's the final surprise. The person you never expected may not be surprising simply because of who they are. They may be surprising because of who you become around them. You don't become smaller. You don't become more anxious. You don't spend your time wondering whether you're enough. You actually feel more like yourself. And I think that's something worth paying attention to, because maybe you've spent years thinking you needed a certain kind of person to make you happy. Someone exciting, someone impressive, someone who gave you that immediate feeling of, this has to be it. But then you meet someone who doesn't create all of that noise, and somehow you're happier. You feel lighter. You laugh more. You feel understood. You start enjoying the ordinary parts of life again. Maybe it's a quiet morning where neither of you has anywhere important to be. You're drinking coffee, they're doing something across the room, and there's nothing particularly dramatic happening. But you look over at them and think, I could actually do life with this person. Or maybe it's something even simpler, a difficult week. You're exhausted. They're exhausted too. But somehow you still make dinner together. You talk. You laugh about something completely ridiculous. And for a moment, everything feels okay. That's the kind of happiness the Nine of Cups makes me think about. Not perfection, fulfillment. The feeling that your life doesn't have to become something completely different to be meaningful. And that's where I want to bring you back to that very first question. Who actually fits into the life you're trying to build? Maybe the answer isn't the person who matches the picture you created years ago. Maybe it's the person who makes that picture feel less important. The person who teaches you that love doesn't have to look impressive to be valuable. It doesn't have to keep you guessing. It doesn't have to hurt in order to feel deep. Sometimes the person you never expected is simply the person who shows you what genuine compatibility actually feels like. And suddenly, the unexpected doesn't feel so unexpected anymore. It feels right. It feels natural. It feels like something you might have overlooked only because you were searching for a different kind of love. So if this reading has resonated with you, I want you to remember this. I am open to love that arrives differently than I imagined. If that speaks to you, put it in the comments. And if you enjoy this reading, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and come back for the next one. Because sometimes the most meaningful part of your story begins when you finally stop insisting that love has to look the way you expected it to.